A Biden administration will try to finish what Trump started. That's the U.S.-China trade war. Biden has worked with Beijing before, but the U.S.-China relationship diminished in recent years, partially due to Trump's trade strategy.
I've been covering this trade war for almost 3 years now, and oftentimes it, looks very chaotic.
The China trade deal is dependent on one thing. Do I want to make it?
If we don't make a deal with China, I'll just raise the tariffs even higher. Thank you very much.
And it's really hard to think back to the beginning of it, but how it really started, it actually seemed like there was a strategy to it.
Over the course of the U.S.-China trade war, Trump's aggressive policies and unpredictable behavior has managed to bring the Chinese to the negotiating table.
We've come to a very substantial phase one deal.
China will continue to eat your lunch unless somebody takes a stand. And it just so happens that it was Donald Trump that took the stand.
We're close.
With the promise of that phase one deal looming on the horizon, can that same aggressive strategy produce meaningful reform in China?
I wrote a paper during the Obama administration saying people are not taking China seriously enough, and the president has to be directly involved for American policy to actually make sense.
I think in some ways it's better to wait till after the election with China. But I'm not going to say that. I just think that.
Now the president's directly involved, and American policy doesn't make sense.
The reality is that the Trump administration has done this in a much more aggressive way than previous administrations have. It was an asset going into this trade war. It may have been a liability in the end.
This is a case study of when negotiating tactics turn from method to madness.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
President Trump ran a successful campaign of denouncing China's unfair trading practices.
They take our money, they take our jobs, and we owe them $1.6 trillion.
I think it's important to understand that the president inherited a very difficult situation, one where we probably should have addressed some of these problems with China a lot sooner. But I think the president had great wisdom and courage to step up and realize that we really can start to make progress.
And after becoming president, his team began devising a strategy on how they could rebalance the relationship with China. And this man, Derek Scissors, was part of those initial conversations.
The goal starts with, we're going to focus on intellectual property, which we were trying to decide, how do we get the Chinese to reduce their intellectual property coercion and theft? They weren't going to stop, but how can we reduce it? How can we show we're serious about this issue, change their behavior? And that got pulled into the president saying, I want high tariffs. I want to reduce the trade deficit, which is a completely different goal. Putting tariffs on all firms doesn't discourage theft and coercion of intellectual property because it doesn't punish the guilty, it punishes everyone.
Tariffs are really the big bazooka in the trade world. You don't like to use them normally, or if you do use them in the trade world, you tend to use them for short-term leverage to try and get someone to the negotiating table.
In March 2018, Ambassador Lighthizer, the trade representative, was testifying on Capitol Hill, and he was kind of laying out what he called an algorithm.
The purpose of your algorithm is to pick out things to the extent you can that are in that category. Things that are in the category of have the maximum effect on China and the minimum effect on U.S. consumers.
The initial number that folks at the U.S. Trade Representative's office came up with was $34 billion.
And the president looks at it and says, well, that's not big enough. And we've seen this a lot in our reporting covering this trade war, that the president really likes round numbers.
A second list of $16 billion of Chinese goods is published, raising the total initial tariffs to $50 billion. And while looking back, this may seem haphazard, it is part of President Trump's strategy.
And this is just the beginning, I want to tell you that. This is just the beginning.
Donald Trump has always had two things he's tried to accomplish through these trade wars. One is selling it domestically to his base. He wants to be seen to be punching China in the nose. And the second thing is his old art of the deal approach, and that is he likes to destabilize people across the negotiating table.
This administration has kind of prided itself on being unpredictable. kind of the notion that unpredictability is a real strength in a negotiation, because if they don't know what you're going to do, somehow they're going to give you more.
But not everyone agrees with that sentiment, at least in regards to the larger intent of getting a deal done with China.
To me, they haven't been unpredictable at all. I think the president has been saying for 2.5 years that he wants to have a deal with China if he can get a deal that is good and that is in U.S. interests. And he's gotten a deal with Korea, and he's gotten a deal with Mexico, and he's gotten a deal with Canada, and he's gotten a deal with Japan, and we're having these negotiations with China.
Early on, the maximum pressure strategy only resulted in the Chinese responding with tariffs of their own, going after areas that could hurt Trump's political base, imposing tariffs on the auto industry, pork, and especially soybeans.
Once the Chinese stopped buying soybeans, the impact in the markets was pretty stark. Immediately, the price collapsed and farmers started getting hit.
So when you engage in this, tit-for-tat tariff war, the question is really who can live with the pain for longer.
And obviously that is a question of political will. And that's always going to be the case, and there's sort of no way around that. Fortunately for us, President Trump has shown that he has that political will.
For the rest of 2018, the two countries would raise tariffs back and forth. The U.S. would go from its initial $50 billion in tariffs to $250 billion, and China's total tariffs would now hit $110 billion of U.S. goods. Eventually, these tariffs would have their desired effect. In December of 2018, President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping would meet face-to-face in Buenos Aires.
Start our meeting where we'll be talking about a number of topics.
At that dinner in Buenos Aires, the two leaders agree that they won't raise tariffs on each other anymore, or at least for 90 days while they try to negotiate a new deal. Over the spring, the two sides keep negotiating, but the Trump administration seems to be moving the goalposts, or at least that's how the Chinese see it. One, they refuse to lift tariffs as part of any deal, and secondly, Trump seems to be constantly increasing the amount of purchases he wants to see from China. At one point, he goes from $1.2 trillion over 6 years to a $2 trillion number, and that just seems both impetuous to the Chinese, but also economically impossible.
By April, the two sides create a 150-page document, and there's optimism that a deal is in sight.
And, the White House was very confident that this, tough negotiating strategy from the president has really, turned out to get results and fix the issues that they went into this trade war for.
My understanding is that both sides were actually discussing where the leaders would meet to sign the agreement.
However, in the final stages of negotiating, the Chinese began to walk back some of their larger concessions. Most importantly, China didn't want to commit to making legal changes for the U.S.
And I think what happened here is that China thought that Trump wanted a deal at any cost, and that he was so out there promising this deal that he wouldn't mind if they took some things off the table.
That's the point where I think the president kind of got fed up, and the events in the negotiations led to an entirely disproportionate response on his part.
In a tweet on May 5th, Trump suddenly raised tariffs on the existing $250 billion worth of goods, and also threatened that he would tax the remaining $325 billion worth of Chinese imports.
That tweet I read on a plane, I was like, okay, I'm going to buy Wi-Fi now, and I worked the entire plane ride over there.
Days later, Trump again escalated the dispute by placing Chinese telecom giant Huawei on a blacklist. That was the biggest slap in the face for the Chinese yet, and relations further deteriorated.
We're having a little squabble with China because we've been treated very unfairly for many, many decades.
But in another face-to-face meeting, this time in Osaka, Japan, Trump and Xi were able to negotiate another truce on further aggression.
So covering this, we often have deja vus and, think, well, we've seen this movie before. They have a truce. It goes on for, a couple months until Trump realizes China, again, didn't live up to its promises.
And that's when Trump unleashed another series of tweets.
So in early August, Trump decides to escalate things again and announces that he is going to put tariffs on the remaining imports from China. Importantly, it's also for the first time really going to hit consumers. It's going to hit things like smartphones, toys, kids' clothes. jobs. And this is the first time that the trade wars are really going to come home for a lot of Americans.
After a year and a half of all this madness, Trump's advisors told him, if you want to get reelected, you have to stop this now. We need to find an off-ramp. And so they came to him for the first time in September and said, why don't we pocket some of these wins? Why don't we get something good for farmers and do something like a partial deal?
The August tariff threats were split up, and the ones that would hit consumer favorites were given a December 15th deadline, with the hopes that a deal could be struck by the end of the year.
A tremendous deal for the farmers, a purchase of from $40 to $50 billion worth of agricultural products.
It's actually hard, as someone who's been following this for several years, to really care about the Phase 1 deal. Agriculture is not going to solve the trade imbalance. It's not going to bring back U.S. manufacturing jobs. For this year, if you sign Phase 1, you don't sign Phase 1, doesn't matter. You're not going to get any meaningful economic changes from the Chinese in 2019 or 2020.
One of the big questions around this trade war is, was it worth it? The real question is, are we going to get future phases in the negotiation, and are you going to get some meaningful changes in China? And a lot of people in Washington, certainly, a lot of longtime China watchers feel like that's not the case.
I think we're finally having serious negotiations with China after many years of frustration, and I think everyone has finally started to realize that we have actual leverage in this situation. And that we have the opportunity to improve the type of trade arrangements that we have with China.
20 months and many false dawns later, what have we learned about the use of this maximum pressure campaign? And can this strategy of unpredictability really work over the long term?
Just so you understand, I've been very mild about it. Very, very mild. There's a long way I can go.
I think, number one, this just shows that trade negotiations are tough. And one of the kind of shortcomings of this negotiation has been we've kind of been all over the map. I mean, at some points, this negotiation's been all about agriculture. Other points, it's been all about these structural issues like IPR.
The main problem the president has is he wants this to wrap up too quickly. The president wants this done now. He wants to run on it. He wants to say, I solved this problem. So because of that, he has lost patience with the pace of negotiations, and he's fine with the outcome of very high U.S. tariffs. That's one thing everyone has to understand. The president doesn't think, oh, I'll pressure the Chinese and they'll automatically give in. He thinks, I'll pressure them and they'll give in, or I'll get to keep the tariffs and the trade deficit will fall. Both are good for me.
We're doing very nicely with China, but I like it the way it is now, because we're taking in billions and billions of dollars and we're giving some of that money to farmers and others.
Now that President Trump is on the cusp of signing a Phase 1 deal, will his willingness to use tariffs really lead to the fundamental economic changes he is seeking from China?
If you want to be a good negotiator, some element of unpredictability is useful. But I think here, we've gotten to the point where we're so unpredictable that other countries are kind of throwing up their hands and trying to decide, is it even worth doing a deal with the United States? Because we don't even know if the United States is going to stick to the deal.
I mean, I think you have to remember that, 2 or 3 years ago, we were being told that the U.S. had very little leverage in trade negotiations, and there really wasn't a lot we could do to get other countries to accommodate our concern. The reality of it is that countries understand that this is the biggest economy in the world. It's a great market. It's an open market. And I think people are always going to be interested in making trade with the United States.
It's fair to say that tariffs brought the Chinese to the table, but what have we gotten out of it? And this gets back to not so much the tool, tariffs, but the strategy. If we don't know our own goals, it's very hard to have a win at the end.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.